Now, when we look at the clinical definitions of substance use disorders, we're going to be looking at DSM-5. So this is the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders, the 5th edition, and that's abbreviated as DSM-5. This is the defining document of the American Psychiatric Association, and it provides the diagnostic criteria and definitions for many psychiatric disorders, well beyond the scope of the substance-related issues we'll be talking about here in class. And it has very complex definitions, which is typical when we talk about psychiatric disorders. Now, when we're looking at substance use disorders, as discussed in the DSM-5, here's the formal definition that they'll use. A problematic pattern of substance use leading to clinically significant impairment or distress as manifested by at least 2 of 11 possible symptoms occurring within a 12-month period. So, this is not a simple, straightforward diagnosis. It's quite complex. And those 11 possible symptoms, 9 of them are behavioral, 2 of them are physiological. So even within those symptoms, we have multiple categories. And those physiological symptoms, that changing model of drug dependence, those do not have to be present for a person to receive the diagnosis of a substance dependence. Now, we also rank those by severity. A person could have a mild substance use disorder or a severe substance use disorder, depending on how many symptoms the treatment professional notes in their behavior. So, interesting question here about whether dependence is caused by the substance itself. And an interesting fact to note is that some drugs are indeed more likely to lead to dependence. And when we talk about inhaled substances, nicotine versus marijuana are an interesting example of this. So if we look at the chart here on the right, and we look at the number of people who are able to use, who are likely to continue to become dependent after a year of nicotine use and after a year of marijuana use, we see that they remain about the same. But as we look at that, smoking that substance becoming a chronic behavior, we find that after 10 years of use, the folks who are continuing to smoke nicotine products are their likelihood of becoming dependent is 15.6, and that for marijuana it's down to 5.9. So we see some real differences over the long term. And then if we look at the lifetime estimate, much higher for nicotine than for marijuana. So there's something specific to the drugs themselves, nicotine and marijuana being an interesting comparison there because they are both smoked. So there's some characteristics about the drug themselves, but then there's lots of other non-drug factors that can influence your risk of dependence. We talked about that desire to alter reality, and that doesn't really affect whether you're smoking nicotine or marijuana. You still have that basic desire to make your life different than it is, or to make it feel different than it is, that may lead you to consume substances, such as either one of those. A question that we've been dealing with in the field for the past several decades is whether the dependence is biological. We talked about that change in the 1960s, and we're trying to figure out whether that's due to specific biochemical or physiological actions in the brain that we can observe and point to. We don't really have clear answers for that, but we have investigated several different categories. And the first one, genetic, is one that we talk about a lot. We've invested genetic markers, physiological markers, and biochemical markers that we can use to test someone and say, is that person dependent or is they not, or are they not dependent? So we do see physiological consequences from drug taking, and we do see a role for genetics, but we don't have a specific test that we can point to that looks for specific factors that we can say will lead to or prevent dependence on a substance or a group of substances. Another question that we encounter a lot is whether there is an addictive personality. This is one that we see discussed quite a bit in popular culture. But because of the nature of scientific experiments, it's really not a question that we can answer. So to be able to truly answer a question like this, we would have to set up an experiment. We'd have to take a group of people and expose them regularly to a drug of dependence, like heroin, and then we'd have to take another group of people that were not exposed to that drug of dependence, and then we'd have to see whether their personalities were different at the end. Now, obviously, there are some very severe moral and ethical concerns about setting up an experiment like that, and it's really not something that we're ever going to be able to do in public health. So what we do is we let people make their own choices, and then we observe them afterwards to see their effects. So if we take a group of people and we survey them when they graduate from high school, and then we survey them again 10 years later, and we look for people who have become regular heroin users, we can expect to find some things at the end of that 10 years that are different about the regular heroin users, but we're not going to be able to say whether the heroin caused that or whether those factors were present before. One personality factor that we do know that we do point to as an indicator of drug dependence is this characteristic of sensation seeking. And what we're able to associate this with is particularly with early substance use and abuse. So it's not necessarily an indicator of later in life substance use and abuse, but we know that early reporting of these behaviors is associated with that sensation seeking personality. So this question of genetics, whether dependence is a family disorder, is also something that we see a lot of discussion of in popular culture. And it's difficult to separate from a dysfunctional family framework. We know particularly with alcohol, probably because of its legal status, that we often see alcohol abuse and alcohol-related disorders, alcohol dependence-related disorders, in the same co-occur with other kinds of family dysfunction. And because, again, of that basic desire to consume substances to alter reality, it's possible that dysfunctional relationships may play a role in dependence, but it's not the only factor. So you may know of people who come from that because of the high prevalence of alcohol-related use and abuse problems in the United States. You may know someone who comes from a family with strong family patterns towards alcohol consumption and has made very different choices, perhaps not to consume alcohol at all. Or maybe they've come out of that background and they do have a very healthy relationship with alcohol where they're able to consume when they want and stop when they want, and they've been able to move beyond that family dysfunctional background. So we know that there are lots of factors that contribute to this, but we do see a role for that dysfunctional family, those dysfunctional family relationships. But it's hard to separate what's due to genetics and then what's due to that family, that nature versus nurture debate. So we have another question that comes up quite a bit when we talk about especially the negative consequences of substance dependence, and that is whether or not dependence on a substance is a disease. One of the first groups to characterize dependence this way were the folks who founded AA, or Alcoholics Anonymous. But there are others who say that dependence isn't really a disease as we understand that in other contexts. There are no tests that a person can be given to see what the underlying cause would be. So there are folks who suggest that this might be better as an analogy than a specific category. So one of the things that we'll talk a lot about here in class is this biopsychosocial perspective, where when we look at substance dependence, it is a complex disorder, and it's related to dysfunctions of biology, personality, and social interactions. So we don't necessarily characterize other diseases in this way, and substance abuse use and abuse may be unique in this fashion. So that we'll come back a lot to that biopsychosocial perspective of substance dependence. Now, here's an interesting one, another question that we see quite a bit. Does drug use cause crime? If we're looking at drugs as a social problem, then the crime that may or may not be related to drug use would be an important part of it. So this breaks down into a couple of different issues. The first one is that drug use may change a person's personality. Now again, we don't really have a lot of evidence to support this because of the immoral or unethical nature of experiments that we could use to prove it. But we do see, when we talked about in our other lecture, things like aggressive behavior, identification with deviant peer groups, we do see some indicators that criminal or antisocial behavior may precede drug use. So there may be some indicators about personality, but we're not able to identify them in any kind of any consistent predictive manner. And then there's a separate issue, which is that people under the influence of drugs may commit crimes. Now, we don't have much evidence that illicit drugs cause criminal behavior. So we're looking at that specific causal relationship. There may be correlations there, but we don't have evidence that illicit drugs actually cause that criminal behavior. But we do have a lot of studies that link alcohol consumption, so again, alcohol as our legal drug, to violent crime. Data tells us that over half of murder victims and over half of people who commit murder are consuming alcohol at the time of the crime. So we really have those separate categories, that drugs may change a person's personality and encourage that criminal behavior from that direction, or that people under the influence, because of the effects of the drug, things like interfering with judgment and good decision making, people may commit crimes while under that influence. And then another issue, drugs can become expensive. Somebody who has a regular pattern of drug consumption has to find a way to fund it. So they may be, those crimes may be related to trying to get money or acquire the drug in other ways. And then finally, our fourth issue, in many cases, consuming the drug is a crime in and of itself. So separate from all of those other kinds of possible criminal behaviors, just strictly consuming the drug, like consuming marijuana for recreational reasons here in Nevada, is a crime in and of itself. So we can see how those that potential relationship between drug consumption and crime can get complicated to define. So we're talking today about drug use as a social problem, and we started by talking about the legal environment for drug use here in the United States. We went through that transition in the 1800s where we went from that laissez-faire attitude to an attempt to regulate drug use. So we do have some things that we need to recognize. The first is that those laws to regulate drug use may have a legitimate social purpose. We'd like to think that when the drugs were developed, they were developed as part of this master plan to protect society from some of the dangers such as criminal behavior that we discussed in the previous slides. However, if we look back at the way that the legal environment for drug use here in the United States developed, we really don't see that rational approach. We tend to see a much more reactive approach, and we'll continue to talk about that here in class. So what we've ended up with is a patchwork system of drug laws that may not be realistic or effective when we look at patterns of drug use and abuse in our society. So wrapping up today, our lecture on Chapter 2, we talked first about physiological versus behavioral toxicity, so the dangerous effects of taking a drug that are related to the actual changes in the body, such as suppressing respiration, or behavioral choices, such as being in a car accident while driving under the influence of alcohol. We talked about DAWN, or the Drug Abuse Warning Network, and how it reflects mostly our views on deviant drug use. So drugs that are more socially acceptable, such as alcohol or nicotine, don't get reported through the system. It is one of our best sources of data on those illicit drugs, and another one that we'll refer back to over the semester. So we talked about physical versus psychological dependence. When we try to define dependence, physical dependence is fairly easy. We're looking at the presence of a withdrawal syndrome when a person stops consuming the substance, versus psychological dependence, the mental need to continue taking the drug, which can be more complicated to define. We looked at our formal definitions of abuse and dependence through the DSM-5. As you move through your week, please don't forget to complete the study guide that goes along with this lecture. Again, those are not collected or submitted or graded, but they're excellent preparation for your exams. You also have your assignments from LearnSmart that are due, and then of course your discussion question. Your main response to the discussion question should be posted by Wednesday of this week, and then replies to at least 2 other classmates by midnight on Saturday. Thank you, and I'll look forward to our next lecture.